Well, welcome. And I'm Ann Marshall. And today it is my deep honor to be with Jane Dunnewold. And what I am so ecstatic about is that it's a very rare opportunity to talk with someone who is deeply involved with textiles and archetypes and the magnificence that art is and the vast expanse that the imaginal world of archetype brings. So we are probably going to have a very big conversation. And Jane, it's just so exciting to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Well, Anne, it's a real privilege, and I'm looking forward to some one-on-one time with you because we don't get nearly enough.
So I'm not going to spend a lot on your bio because it is very extensive. You have had a long history and have been involved in I'll say the industry for decades. And I'm sure that there's been quite an evolution throughout your time. But I know you've been very much a teacher for probably decades, and you also are an award-winning artist. I think you've had quite an impact on the industry in general. And what I love is that you really bring a sense of introspection. And I think spirituality is a good word to use with you. And then, of course, the mechanism or the medium that you use is cloth, collage, surface design, and imagination. So is there anything else that you want to add to that, like in a kind of formal way, so that people might be a good context for our beginning?
Well, thank you. I think you've covered most of what holds together for me and has coalesced into the person that I am. And it's certainly been a very rewarding and challenging life that I have led as an artist and an educator and a writer, but every single day I realize how fortunate I am. And so that feeling of satisfaction on a daily basis it isn't that the awards and the nice things that have happened don't ever count for anything, but I think getting to a point where you find inner peace with the combination of things that you've put together for your life is probably its own reward in many ways.
Sounds like a good place to be and a great place to continue to create out of, because it's a nice foundation, having that peace of mind, and then it can open way to what's next.
Right.
So do you have a sense of when you started down that creative path?
Well, I know we can speak archetypally with each other here, and I have a huge nature child. And when I was a kid, I did grow up in rural Ohio, and I loved to be outdoors, and the kinds of creative projects that we did then. I think when I look back on it now, and I was just with my three sisters because, my mother passed in October. I just spent the weekend with my three sisters reminiscing and looking at old photographs. And my sister Anne, who's right behind me, and I spent a lot of time roaming in the woods. And we dragged two logs across a relatively small stream and got boards from my dad's wood bin and nailed them to make a bridge. And then we got the mud, which was kind of an orange brown in that part of Ohio, and mixed it with water and painted symbols on our bridge. And so those were the kinds of projects at a really early age that I loved the most. And in the meantime, we were in 4-H, as a lot of rural kids were. And if you're not familiar with it, it's an organization for kids where there are cooking classes and there are sewing classes, and your little group, kind of your little club, gets together, and all the girls in your little group, 10 or 12 girls, take the same sewing class together and do that sort of thing. And so I did learn how to make a blouse, but I couldn't sew within an inch of my life, and I never really enjoyed it. So it's kind of ironic that I ended up as I have, but that wasn't the direction my creative mind was going at that point in time. And over the course of my teenage years, I taught myself how to very crudely bind my own book of poetry. And I did really enjoy painting. We didn't have much opportunity. My parents weren't really big on getting art supplies, but that creative part of me was definitely inside.
And one of the things I really appreciate about you that I think separates you from other artists is the fact that you are so willing and very generous in promoting and bringing out and sparking the creativity in your students and the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really remarkable, that seems to be a really big calling, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Well, it comes from a shadow side and it comes from a light side. I did think I was going to go into the ministry, and I did plan to go to divinity school after I got my degree in psychology. And I didn't, because instead I moved to Boston and started taking embroidery and quilting classes following a boyfriend. And so I didn't go into the ministry, but about 6 years before my dad died, who was completely incapacitated and in an assisted care living center at that point and mute, didn't speak. I went to visit him while I was in Ohio, and I was sitting next to his bed, and I thought, I'm going to tell him everything, even though I have no idea whether he can hear me. And so I poured this all out, that we were okay, and that Zena was going to be okay, and that I had just been teaching at QSDS and how much I love teaching and my students. And he opened his eyes and looked at me and said, "You found your ministry."
Wow.
And laid back down and closed his eyes. The last thing he ever said to me. And he lived 8 more years. So that was an astonishing moment of affirmation, really. But the other side is that I don't have a degree in what I do. I don't have an art background. I always felt very insecure and defensive about that, and very protective and guarded of what I did know. And I finally decided the only way I could get past that shadow was to make a conscious choice to share everything.
Mm-hmm.
And not sit and question, oh, who should I tell someone that? Should I tell? I've got to keep this all to myself. I mean, I realized that when you teach, and this is true of all teachers, if you're teaching and you do a good job, the people that learn from you are going to want to use it in ways that benefit them and further their lives. And that's bound to ripple out and touch more people and more people and more people. And that's a really good thing. And that even when we don't feel generous because we feel afraid, because it's all fear-based, I'm just going to do it anyway. That became my mantra for the first, I don't know, in my 40s, after my bankruptcy and my divorce. That became my mantra, because I didn't want to model fear and I didn't want to model stinginess, because I'd been treated that way and it didn't work.
And for people watching, definitely take a look at Jane's YouTube channel, because the prolificness and the amount and diversity of the videos and the information shared is really something to enjoy, take advantage of, and allow to have some impact on your own artwork. I just think you cover a lot of territory. I mean, I've got just a couple of your books here, and it's only a small sampling. And lately I've taken the background and textured class, and there's so much. I mean, it was kind of really overwhelming. I actually set aside a month to work my way through that, because the amount of information is a lot. But I just so am grateful to you for kind of opening up the playing field for other people to share and encourage and really help inspire. And I think that that can only serve the world in a better way.
I hope so. Plus, it's fun. You know, it's like the first time one of your, well, I only have one kid, but the first time my granddaughter did a particular thing, or my daughter, and I just felt such a huge sense of joy from it. And that's how I feel when I'm in the classroom. I just feel so happy when other people accomplish things and I was able to contribute in some way. There's nothing like it. It's the best. It's the best. And part of that is that I think you have to get over yourself and feeling threatened by it. And I think that's a shortcoming for a lot of teachers, not just in my field, but in general, is that it's so easy to start feeling threatened and building kind of walls around what you've taught people instead of assuming that, I mean, that's what evolution is. Somebody took somebody else's idea and it spurred an inspiration for them. And then they went and did their own explorations. And that's how we got the computer. It's how we got everything good. So why don't we all be in on that?
Yeah. And I think coming from that same place, you know, what is really noteworthy as well is the fact that you've created a community in this very safe space that really allows people to, on the peer level, be able to communicate and to bring thought-provoking challenges that they may have or questions. And I know that supportive community seems to also be a very important aspect of what you're providing right now.
Thank you. I think that's true. I think that's true. And I think one of the important reasons that it works is because it's a level playing field. It's inclusive and everybody's welcome. And there's never a sense that anyone is less than because they don't have that much experience or they're a newbie or whatever. You know, I was involved in an organization for a really long time that I finally quit, partly because, and it wasn't that the people didn't mean well and they weren't nice, the other members, and it was a sort of thing where there was within the organization kind of an elitist attitude and a sort of a feeling of us, the educated, academic, successful professionals, and them, the hobbyists, and they're not as important as we are. And I think that's frequently a flaw in organizations of all kinds, but it made me very, very aware that I didn't want the world I occupy or create to be like that. And so it's astounding to me that within CST, there are people who, and let's face it, it's mainly women. This last year, I think it was entirely women. I talked the only man who wanted to join out of it, but that's another story. But I find it really astonishing that there are women with far lengthier degrees than I have, doing all kinds of spectacular work, some of whom are retired and some of whom are still working. And yet there are also members who have never made anything and they just wanted to learn to be creative and they thought it might be the right atmosphere. Or they were so miserly with their stuff, they had all this nice stuff, but they didn't ever use any of it. And so I think one of the things that's so positive about the environment that we've created, and yeah, I led, but it takes the whole community to build the environment. And so everyone has contributed to this. And it means that we're all doing the best we can to be accepting of one another and to be encouraging of one another, no matter where we are on the continuum of experience. And I think that's really valuable. And I also think it's kind of unusual.
Very, very much so, I believe. And that the program I think we're referring to is the creative strength training.
Yes.
And that's a 10-month program that has multiple layers and components to it. So I encourage people to check that out if there's any interest in that. Now, are you still doing the master's series?
No, I'm not doing the mastery program right now because once the pandemic hit and I had to finish out, it was actually, for those who wouldn't know, it was actually a 2.5-year program where the same people came to San Antonio 5 times for 6 days at a time and studied surface design and worked on improving their work and building a series, et cetera. And I had to finish up the program that was underway online, which worked okay, but it wasn't the same as people being able to come to the studio. And it led to the dissolution of all of my classes in 2020, everything on the road, everything was canceled at the end of March. And so the studio that I had, which had been built expressly for teaching 12 students at a time, became a huge money pit. And I wanted to live closer to my daughter, and there were a whole lot of complications, not really complications, but there were a lot of factors that led to making the decision to close the studio and sell it and move up here closer to Austin. And that's all worked out really well. But the downside is that I don't have that space, and that when you teach surface design on a regular basis, you've got to have enough space and sinks and water for everybody. So that's kind of a hiatus right now. I don't know if, go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you.
If I found a space somewhere here in Austin where I could do that on a regular basis, I might go back to it again, and I might still figure out how to do it online because technology is making it easier to actually share work and be present with other people. But I'm not there yet.
So I'm really curious then, since you went from that large studio to an adapted garage, I believe.
Yeah.
Has that had you prioritize what's important to you in terms of art making and even the tools and resources you have? Have you found that you've had to adapt some thinking around project making or?
Well, yeah, I think the biggest realization that I had was that in 2018, I was really lucky and invited to be in a 6-person, relatively short run exhibition at the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio, which is really, really a gorgeous contemporary museum. And I did 14 large pieces for that exhibition that all started as quilt blocks that other people had abandoned. And they were very large pieces, and they were covered with gold leaf. They were beautiful pieces, but they're bigger than most people can afford. And they're bigger than most people, a lot of people anyway, don't have even the wall space for pieces that large. They were meant to be showstoppers so that I could see if I could do it. But after that show, I thought, I made the conscious decision that I wasn't going to work that large anymore because I have a whole storeroom of stuff upstairs that's big. And even though I've sold some work, that hasn't been my primary source of income by a long shot. And I just figured at this age, I would downsize not only my studio, but also the scale of the work that I do. But the second thing that I realized, and it took me a long time to come to terms and acknowledge this, is that I feel as though I've been given, there's a Paul Simon song that has the perfect line in it, been given everything I want, only 3 generations off the boat, indicating working hard and having a certain level of achievement. And I just decided, especially when CST proved to be popular, and I felt that it was really impacting the members in a positive way. I decided that I would spend the rest of my life less focused on making artwork and more focused on being a mentor and a guide. Because I get so much out of it. It's my turn now to give back, I think. And so that's really a higher priority than whether I have another show or whether I get into I'm not big on galleries. I have one right now, but in general, they've never liked me and I've never liked them. So that just didn't really work. But anyway, it's more important to work with people right now.
And part of the tool, I'd say that I understand that you incorporate is using not only chakras, but archetypes relative to someone's creativity. So maybe you can give a quick just definition of archetype and then how you've come to use that influence.
Sure. Well, I would say that the most straightforward definition of an archetype is that these are universal patterns of behavior that we all recognize in other people as well as in ourselves. And they may change a little bit over generations, but in general, they're patterns that were recognized long before you and I were on the planet. And I specifically became interested because of reading Caroline Myss's Sacred Contracts in 2002. And so that's when I started studying them. And this is true of the spiritual bent in me in a general way. I feel that making art and being a creative human being, which everybody has a birthright to be, is, at least for me, it's one of the highest privileges that we have as humans. And the things that I have always read and the things that I've been drawn to, I did an entire series on the Tao Te Ching in 2001. And so there's been this thread of spirituality and thoughtfulness when it comes to the aspects of us that are below the surface, really my entire life, probably starting when I thought I'd go to divinity school. But I have been profoundly influenced by reading sacred and working with sacred contracts over these 20 years. And the more I worked with them and recognized the archetypes that I have as my personal 12, the more I started to understand how they impacted my creative energy and how that was related to our energetic system, which of course is where the chakras come in, and how it all fit together to become the creative whole that I was. And that if that was true for me, then it had to be true of everybody else as well. And that maybe if I started talking about this and didn't feel like I had to separate it, I've been very defensive. For the longest time, I was pretty defensive to keep the spiritual part of what I did and the art part of what I did separate from one another, because I didn't want to offend anyone in a classroom or allow them to think that I was woo-woo in some way. And I've totally gotten over that.
Yay.
Yeah, really. I mean, it took a while, but I think that, I don't know, probably because I grew up in the Midwest. And my version of Protestantism was social justice and pretty straightforward. And there wasn't room for a lot of spiritual stuff in an interesting sort of conflicted way. But in any event, now that I have been working longer and more specifically with creativity as it relates to archetypes, it has been very entertaining and affirming to recognize how helpful it is. And you know this with the background that you have in archetypes as well, how helpful it is when we begin to get a handle on what our archetypes are and how they are orchestrating our lives, whether we're aware of it or not. And so when we can talk, for instance, about the dilettante from an artistic standpoint and put the myth to rest that somehow a dilettante is always a bad thing, and we can recognize that there are plenty of people on the planet who love to experiment and play with art techniques, and they're dilettantes through and through, and there's nothing wrong with it. In the same way, there's nothing wrong with being introverted or extroverted. It just is. And so I think that's when it can become really useful, because we can start articulating patterns that we see in ourselves, like the saboteur. We can articulate the qualities of the saboteur being reflected in procrastination and perfectionism and needing to logic everything out in advance before you start drawing or before you start stitching or whatever it is. When you can talk about these shadow creative behaviors that we can all succumb to on occasion, it depersonalizes it slightly, so we can get over feeling like we're bad people, and we can just acknowledge that here this pattern is beginning, and now what do I do to change that pattern or shift the energy a little bit?
Mm-hmm. That self-knowledge, I read one of your quotes, like the creativity requires self-knowledge and stamina.
Yeah.
And I got the picture that when you were talking, it was like between chakras and archetypes. I felt like this real holographic wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And with, I'll say, claiming that or embracing it, have you noticed that it provides a clear direction for you versus if you didn't have that kind of understanding?
Oh, I think so. I definitely think so. I think so. And I think it helps a lot. You know, I can really only speak for myself, but I've done enough teaching and guiding that I have seen it in other people. So I know it. When I began to recognize my own shadow, you know, there have been times, even in last fall, there were a couple of times, I found out in a kind of an awkward way that another book that I'd written a long time ago had been sold to someone who now is selling it online as a PDF, and I wasn't involved in the decision. And I called Zena up and I started telling her this, and I was pretty upset at the time. And she said, you know, you ought to take a breath because your victim has really kicked in right now.
Victim was running the show.
The victim was running the show, and the saboteur was right there next to him, her.
Double whammy.
Yeah, tag teaming me. So I think that particular part of this has really been helpful for me. And, you know, I think Caroline Myss wrote, and I might have even seen this recently, that the shadow is the part of ourselves that we are still not looking at or are afraid to look at. And I think that's one of the values from a creative standpoint, because my little corner of this universe is how the archetypes work with artists in creative ways. I could never touch the larger volume of everything that she's done and written and, you know, shared with the world. But I think from the standpoint of artists and creatives, it can really help us get a handle on what the shadows are, so that we can strengthen, for lack of a better word, our creative lives by recognizing what patterns we're prone to that can be self-destructive or can shut us down or stop us from working.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that is certainly available to the artist. You know, even getting past making that first mark sometimes is requires kind of pushing through or an understanding of which influence is getting in the way or which influence can be called upon to make the way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Do you have a I don't know, a favorite archetype du jour for the day? It might be one of your 12 or one that's kind of visiting you fleetingly, or one you've been pondering about or met up with. Just
Well, I'm still working on the light side of my damsel, because I lived in the shadow side of the damsel for the first 40 years of my life. Well, 35 years of my life, until my daughter was born. But I never really, it was really, you know, I think this is one of the things that you may or may, you probably agree with me. One of the things about archetypes is that the the names themselves can give people fits because of the associations that we have with words like prostitute and victim and vampire, etc. There are some archetypes have names where you think, how could there ever be anything positive about that? And I think that's kind of where I was with the damsel for a really long time. And it's only been recently through a course that I took that it was pointed out to me. And then I read a great book, which your reader, your listenership might be interested in, The Heroine with 1,001 Faces, which was riffing on Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. And that book was recommended to me as part of this conversation that I was having. And the book's premise, as well as the premise that was shared with me, is that the damsel, the light side of the damsel, is the part of the princesses and damsels in fairy tales that was downplayed over time because of the patriarchy. Because damsels like Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty and all of them, Cinderella is a great example, they all overcame incredible odds and negative circumstances to prevail. And that in a sense, the traditional fairy tale story where the princess gets a prince is actually a symbolic version of women claiming their masculine energy. And once I started thinking about it from that perspective, it made me recognize that that's exactly my damsel's story. I kept waiting and waiting to be rescued, and it never happened. And then I started to take care of myself because I had to. And I overcame some fairly difficult situations in my life, including my bankruptcy and my divorce in 1990, to just build some stamina and stay the course and reach a place where now I can be, I will never be a queen, but I think now I'm a damsel that has evolved into a version of a benevolent queen who can give back and feel secure in her energy and her power. And so that's the one that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because that's one of the ones that probably the one that gave me the most fits.
Kind of reminds me a little bit about when you were talking about not mixing the spirituality in the classroom, but now it's like, you know, it is a part of you, and spirituality could be seen as that feminine aspect that maybe gets dampened in a more patriarchal world. But at this point, you know, you're letting it all out, and it is, you know, you're taking claim for what is so, and unabashedly, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. My rebel saying, okay, I've reached this age. I'm doing whatever I want, and I'm not doing anything I don't want to do. And I am going to choose to pour out everything I've got if I want to and share it.
Ooh, that's a lot of archetype conversation right there.
Oh, yeah.
Take that in.
Yeah.
What do you think is next for you? What's on your horizon?
Well, I'm not sure, but one project that has been percolating for a long time, 5 or 6 years, maybe probably longer than that, probably back at least to 2016, when the Creative Strength Training book was published. In my mind, the next book that I wanted to write was actually going to be a study of archetypes from a creative perspective specifically. And then the bottom sort of fell out of that world back to the damsel, because I had such high hopes that the CST book would do really, really well, but in fact, the publisher was on the brink of bankruptcy and nobody knew it.
Oh.
And so the company went bankrupt and was sold, and my book, along with a lot of other books, just sort of disappeared into oblivion. It's still in print, and if I push it, I can talk people into selling it, but there was never any marketing help. There was never anything that would have allowed it to really reach a larger market. And that was the damsel and the victim right there. Oh, this is happening to me. I don't deserve this. But anyhow, it is what it is. And it led to a lot of other things that were really, really good that needed the structure of that first in order to manifest. But what I'm really thinking about this year is that because the online program has been running for a number of years, I have a whole pile of essays on archetypes, because I write one every month from the creative perspective. And I'm thinking that even though it's not the kind of book that somebody might expect from me, I'm kind of thinking that I'm going to take those essays and go back and edit them all. And for my own satisfaction, since we can do it and put it on Amazon, I think I'm going to go ahead and do that project next, and just see where that goes, and maybe even illustrate it with artwork from some of the archetype exhibitions that CST members have participated in.
Wow. I think that's a huge contribution to the art world. And I think it's ahead of its time. So do you have the pioneer?
Well, I thought I had a pioneer.
Visionary?
Then I realized I really have a visionary. And my Midwest background disallowed choosing the visionary because you're too full of yourself if you think you're a visionary. So I had to settle for pioneer for the first 18 years. Then I was in the fall, I was doing a series of art for my own satisfaction, smaller fabric collages that were each of my archetypes. And I was just doing them intuitively. And it was really fun, but I got to the pioneer, and for the life of me, I couldn't come up with any images. I couldn't think of anything. And in the middle of the night, I woke up, which is frequently true for me. And I thought, well, duh, it's because you don't have a pioneer. You have a visionary, but you've never wanted to claim it because you were afraid people would think you were too big for your britches.
Wow.
And as soon as I got up the next morning, I went down and went in the studio and made my visionary piece, and that sort of sealed the deal.
And again, I think that's the light side of the damsel showing up for you, kind of saying, carrying that flag. It's a visionary.
Yeah, it's also interesting, isn't it?
Oh, wow. Ooh. And in terms of opportunities for students, I think certainly going to Jane's website there will give you what's on the docket and available. I know you have a new book coming out as well. When is that expected, and what is that about?
It's a book on paper lamination, which is a process I invented in the way that I do it. I invented it. It's not like it was never done before then, it was. But I decided to update it and add all new information to an older version that I co-authored with somebody else. And so actually, since we're self-publishing, Wayne's picking it up on Friday. So next week will become a shipping week for us.
Ooh-wee.
And there are still copies on my website, but our basic strategy is to get the number of copies we can afford and sell those, and then transfer it over to Amazon. So it'll probably be on Amazon by, I don't know, end of March, probably.
Awesome. And all kinds of online classes as well. And of course, the CST. Any other opportunities you want to refer to?
No, the website has most everything that's going on, and we're just here having some fun and cranking along.
I think you're very prolific, and again, I've said generous, and filled with such humility. There's just a beautiful quality of humbleness. So I'm curious, though, as we bring our conversation to a close, what would you like the world to know?
Hmm. Well, I'm not sure I have any major words of wisdom, but if anything, it makes me happy when people are kinder to themselves and try and include as part of their self-care some small creative thing on a regular basis. And sometimes we don't know what that is and we have to sit with it and think about it. But I really do think that the creative muscle that we have is as important as our eyes and our ears and our nose and our mouth and all those other 5 senses. And that the creative sense is also there if we just claim it, and that and to pay attention to how we talk to ourselves and to try to be a little bit nicer, because we can be so hard on ourselves and so critical, and that's not getting anybody anywhere. So.
Kindness and creativity as a part of self-care. Wow, I don't think you read about that in the books or see that on the Today Show. But it's
maybe
really,
we need to write a new book, Anne.
and that really resonates with me. That was just beautifully phrased. Oh, thank you so much for your time today. An aura of inspiration, and I think I want to say something like of authenticity. There's like just a landing in your words, and I feel this huge support. Which archetype is it that brings that support? Is it the teacher or the guide, or is there another one that brings that level of support?
For me, it's the guide.
Okay.
And I actually have the guide in the 9th house, and I don't remember exactly what the 9th house is, but it's related to working with other people.
And spirituality.
Yeah.
Wow. Showing us the spiritual way. Kindness. Kindness is a spiritual path, and creativity is a spiritual path. Wow. That really fits. So those are good parting words.
Well, thanks so much again for inviting me. I've just had the best time talking to you.
Oh, my pleasure. And I hope everybody really enjoys and lets the word sink in. Thank you, Jane.
You're very welcome.